Hi all. Some really good conversation going on this week about with the ethics of this topic. It is one of these topics that really grabs you because it's so powerful and so big and so inhumane. The degradation of our fellow human beings is shocking. And I love this little visualization from Slate magazine that shows the passages of ships and the increasing passages, and it gives you some sense of the number, and then everyone's little dot represents hundreds of captured bodies being taken off to a tremendous uncertainty and lives of degradation. It's an amazing story and a horrible story. Um, so a number of you, as we urged you in the toolbox section, have been grappling with that ethical dimension of history writing. So how do we treat stories where there's a moral challenge to our thinking? And in topics like the slave trade, and here we might add topics such as the Holocaust, the Chinese Cultural Revolution, and other mass crimes, we're confronted with stories where the level of human indignation is so great that we find them really difficult to fathom. Many of you have decried these people's treatments, but a number of you also haven't really explored the details. You've kind of got stuck at that level of indignation and your moral outrage at the story. And I totally get that. I mean, it is a moral outrageous story. But I really want to urge you to continue to dig deeper into these stories. I want to suggest to you that that's easy, that it's easy to simply decry these horrible stories, but that we still need to dig deep into them in order to properly understand them. And thus we still need to dig in deep into the archives and the research. We need to go beyond the easy condemnations and talk about these stories. We need to do it in detail, and we need to do it rigorously. We need to understand the mind of the oppressor, in this case the mind of the slave holder, the slave trader. Why? Well, one might think, well, this is obvious. It's a huge crime. It's a crime against humanity to own other people. And I totally agree with that sentiment. But there are people in the world, in the past and today, who take advantage of the very complexity of the tales to sell a wholly different version. So, for example, there are people in the world today who deny that the Holocaust happened. Very few of them are serious historians. There's one notable exception, I'll mention him in a minute. And almost all of them are racists who proclaim themselves to be defenders of the white race and so on. And that one serious historian that I mentioned in the last sentence is one of those people. These people seize upon two simple points to cast doubt on the story. One, it's complexity. And they say, well, how do we really know that 6 million people, most of them Jews, were murdered by the Nazi German state? And two, it's simplicity. Because it's so complex that many people have never actually read the serious history of the Holocaust, and thus they never see the overwhelmingly clear evidence. Thus it's easy to say, you have no proof. And who among us will actually then go to the library to see it? Some will, but the racists count on not many doing so. The slave trade has its own doubters. Here, they don't argue with the numbers, and even the unfortunate dimensions of the story. They use that word unfortunate a lot. And so it's an interesting word in this context because it both appears to be sympathetic and yet undercuts the significance in one word. But they do find fault with the issue of treatment. They argue, for example, that most slaves were happy because they were treated well by their masters. There were exceptions, of course, but they were just bad apples. And so on with other details. But the most pernicious story today is the so-called Irish slave story. Purveyors of the story argue that the Irish were enslaved too, and some argue in greater numbers and subjected to greater indignities, and so on. This is a myth. In fact, it's a total fabrication, a totally complete fabrication designed by racists to undercut black political movements which are intended to counter ongoing anti-black racism. This is especially true in the United States, though there's a group in Canada too. And here I'll just show you really, really quickly. This is a map by an Irish historian by the name of Liam Hogan, who has counted uses of the Irish were slaves to memes on Facebook across North America, and each one of these dots represents a count or a place where he's seen that meme used. And you can certainly see Canada's not as dense as the United States, although Southern Ontario is, and you can see it's widely used there. What they too seize on is a grain of truth. Many Irish people were indentured servants who came to America. Some of them forcibly during the Cromwellian period, when Cromwell's parliamentary government during the English Revolution seized control of Ireland. But these racist groups seize on the Irish because they were a colony of Britain. So there's this kind of story of two colonizations going on here. Their argument runs that Irish people were rounded up by the British and sold into slavery in America, where they were whipped, beaten, and made to suffer in much the same way as Africans. Again, there's a grain of truth there. Irish indentured servants certainly existed and sometimes were whipped and abused in other ways, but it had little to do with them being Irish. It had to do with their legal status as indentured servants. And as you saw in Rodriguez this week, when their term was up, they resumed full status as free subjects. To be clear, there was no systematic rounding up of the Irish population. Poor people in many countries became indentured servants. Indeed, legally, becoming an apprentice to a master craftsman also suspended one's legal standing as a free person. Both of these forms were strategies by which poor people attempted to improve their place in the world. Were they sometimes abused along the way? Yes, no doubt, but not in the kind of systematic fashion we see in slavery. Not thousands of vessels carrying millions of people over almost 3 centuries. Not factories established along the coast of Africa where slaves were being held before being transported on board vessels for the New World. Not the kind of lifelong servitude. Not the children of slaves automatically being born as slaves and so on. Nothing like that. So why do these people argue this position? It's because they resent programs designed to support historically disadvantaged peoples like American blacks. Claiming that the Irish were slaves too, they then say, and we got over it. We don't whine on. We don't want handouts from the government and that sort of thing. And so that leads to this kind of Facebook presence, meme presence. You can see here on the left-hand side, one of the complaints. When was the last time you heard an Irishman bitching about how the world owes them a living? And then there's a picture there of boy coal miners from the 1920s. What that has to do with Irish slaves in the 17th and 18th century, I have no idea. But that's kind of part of the problem here. I'll show you one more quick illustration of this, and this is a constant theme, and note the Confederate flag. Why aren't Irish Americans in an outrage? They were the first slaves, and they were treated worse than African American slaves. Bet most people don't even know that. Well, there's a good reason they don't know that. Were Irish people treated badly in these situations? I don't think there's any doubt of that whatsoever. But not nearly the same numbers and not nearly the same conditions. And they weren't slaves. They were indentured servants. Nasty stuff to be sure, but it's not the same. How do we know all this is true? We know because of careful, rigorous research. And that's why I want you to go past the easy statements decrying slavery and really dig into this and into other topics as well. But this is a good example of the ethical dimension here. We'll pursue the question of why supporters of slavery held these positions in a later lesson. But for now, I want you to see the magnitude of the story, and it truly is huge, and to see its role in building an Atlantic economy, for which it was certainly foundational.